Imagine just for a second that the word freedom, maybe the most American ideal there is, has actually been weaponized for 2 centuries to justify oppression.
This sounds completely backward.
It does. We're all taught that liberty is the antidote to tyranny. But what if the language of liberty can actually be a cover for it?
And that is the central and pretty unsettling question in Freedom's Dominion, a saga of white resistance to federal power by Jefferson Cowie.
Pulitzer winner, right?
It is. It's a deep look at how a very specific, aggressive brand of freedom was built in one place, Barbour County, Alabama.
Here are the most game-changing essential insights from Freedom's Dominion practical wisdom that could transform how you think and act. So let's get into the first big insight. This idea of freedom as, well, as a form of racialized anti-statism.
To get it, we have to go way back to the 1830s, to the violent seizure of Creek tribal lands. Now, normally you'd call settlers taking land by force, conquest. But Cowie finds this crucial psychological flip. As the author explains, the settlers didn't see themselves as conquerors. They framed their theft of land as resistance to federal tyranny.
Wait, tyranny because the federal government was trying to stop the theft?
Exactly that. Washington was attempting, maybe feebly, but it was attempting to enforce treaties that protected indigenous sovereignty.
So when the settlers fought back, they weren't just saying, we want this land.
No, they were saying, the federal government is oppressing our local liberty by telling us we can't take this land. Cowie calls this racialized anti-statism.
That is just a wild mental gymnastic. It's claiming victimhood while you're the one holding the gun.
It is. But here's the simple way to apply this. Watch for when powerful groups claim they're being oppressed simply because they're being told not to oppress others.
And that template, it just gets set in stone from there.
Absolutely. Freedom becomes defined as local control, as the absence of federal interference. This becomes the standard for the next century.
Which brings us to a real myth-busting revelation. Everything you thought about freedom being universal, that might be wrong in this context.
It's built on a zero-sum game. Cowie details this disturbing contradiction. White freedom was explicitly built on black unfreedom. It was a coherent worldview where white autonomy required the ability to control others.
So when Reconstruction or voting rights come along,
the local white population doesn't see that as an expansion of equality.
Of course not, because in a zero-sum game, if I gain rights, you feel like you're losing them.
Precisely. They viewed black voting rights as federal oppression of white citizens. The author notes they used every tool, gerrymandering, even federal slum clearance grants, to seize black homes.
It really contextualizes the modern debates on things like reverse discrimination.
If you see freedom as a finite pie, anyone else getting a slice feels like theft.
This is Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Now, you might be thinking, why focus on one single county in Alabama? Is it just an outlier?
Yeah, why Barbour County? What's so special about it?
This is the real power of what's called microhistory. Barbour County, Cowie argues, is quintessentially American because its history, settler colonialism, civil rights resistance, it mirrors the nation's entire story.
He mentions Alabama fever, right? The land rushes?
Yes, these intense land rushes. It shows how those big, abstract national debates from history books were actually lived and fought and rationalized on the ground at the local level.
And speaking of local, Barbour County produced one of the most infamous politicians in American history, George Wallace.
The segregationist governor. But here's the key insight from the book. Wallace didn't just invent that rhetoric.
He inherited it.
100%. As Cowie demonstrates, he was the culmination of 130 years of this political messaging, straight out of Barbour County. It wasn't some unique monster. He just took the local product and made it national.
He repackaged that grievance, that freedom from federal oversight, for everyone.
And framed equal ballot access, not as a civil right, but as a threat to individual liberty.
Which, you have to say, sounds eerily familiar to a lot of anti-government rhetoric we still hear. But was this freedom to dominate only a domestic thing? Did it stop at the U.S. border?
No, and this is where Cowie really connects the dots globally. He brings in W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of white freedom's world-transforming power.
How so?
There's a direct line from removing indigenous people in Alabama to overseas imperialism. The logic is, if you can dominate at home.
You can dominate abroad, so the federal government was the enemy when it protected rights at home.
But it was the best friend of freedom when it enabled global dominion.
It really forces you to ask, when we hear the word freedom today, are we talking about liberation for everyone? Or is it just license for some people to do whatever they want? It's something to sit with. Start with our 5-minute essential insights, then dive into the in-depth analysis. Next, the summary, ending with the comprehensive critique.
Discover genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.